Okay, I'm gonna call them, kiddos.
Uh-oh, yay. Allison, you're gonna be like... Oh, cool. They're so loud. Allison, you're gonna be like this. Yeah. That's a cool picture. Allison, you're like...
Hey, Mr. Aiken, we're ready when you are. Whoops, hold on. Hi, Mr. Aiken, we're ready when you are. Just give us a call. Thanks. That was a video message. How do you like that? Oh, look at Kaylee's. Kayla's like. All right. So while we wait for him, kiddos, let's review very quickly what I taught you yesterday, okay, while we wait, because he's probably still setting up, and that's fine. He knows it's 9:15 to 10:05, or 10 o'clock because we have picture day. So you're going to raise your hand when you have something to say, but I'm going to continue because people were shouting out. Yesterday we talked about how the French and Indian War was not a war of France versus the Indians. Who was it a war between? Raise your hand if you know. Who was it a war between? Charlie?
The Indians, the French, and the English.
Good. And it wasn't really a three-way war, though, but those were all the parties involved, and there were actually another party involved, too. But how did it kind of work? So Charlie gave us 3 of the 4 major parts. What how did it work, Aiden?
Well, some of the Indians went on the French side, and some of the other Indians went on the Great Britain side.
The British side, good. And then there was another group that was involved. Do you remember who it was? So we said France, England, and the Indians, but you're leaving out one very important group that I feel kind of badly about. They're just forgotten completely.
Yeah, we don't care about that.
All right, Chris?
Maybe the Spanish?
No, but they might have been involved, but I didn't teach you that. It was somebody I taught you about. Kayla?
Is it the colonists?
It was the colonists, right? Right, guys? Whose side were the colonists on?
The British.
They were on the British side. Now, they didn't go fighting, but they would have supported any efforts that the British would have wanted. Do you understand that? I didn't explain it totally, but do you understand that they didn't support the French?
No.
Right? They supported England if they supported anybody. All right? So the French and Indian War, it was a bit of a mix between some Indians, the French, the British, and the colonists all kind of fighting. And then what happened? What is it? Well, I don't know how I want to ask the question. The French and Indian War cost a lot of money, right?
Yes. Right.
So what did England do to try to make up for some of that money? What did England do? Luke?
They made more taxes and
Yeah.
started taxing the colonists.
They started taxing the colonists. And tell me about how the colonists felt at first, though, and be careful. This is a bit of a trick question. How did the colonists feel at first about all the taxes? How did they? That's just somebody getting online. How did they feel at first, Tucker?
They were kind of happy.
They were kind of happy. I don't know if happy is the right word, but they weren't mad, right? They weren't mad at first. Did they understand taxes have to happen most of the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, at first they kind of understood. But then what happened? Then what happened? I'd love a few more hands just so I know that we're getting like groups to understand some stuff. Nick?
After a while, the taxes went up.
After a while, there became more and more taxes that cost more and more money.
Because England was still supporting their side of the war with the guns and weapons and stuff.
And the guns and weapons probably ended at some point, but they were still in debt because of the war, and they still needed to make money, so they still got more money from the colonists. How did that make the colonists feel? And was there anything else involved? I guess is really the question. Hannah?
Well, they were like, this is kind of like a lot of tax, but we want to say in it.
We'd like a say in how we're taxed, right? What did England say about that, Hannah?
No.
No, you can't have a say, right?
No.
You don't get to be in Parliament with us,
Too
right?
bad.
Uh-oh, what was the phrase that Americans came up with to show that they weren't happy about this? What was the phrase that they came up with? Kendall?
Taxation without representation.
No taxation without representation. So don't tax us if we can't represent ourselves in Parliament, right? Do you remember what it meant?
Yeah.
All right. And then after they did that, it was all downhill, wasn't it? Like America started doing things. Do you remember some of the things they did to the British or the tax collectors or the whatevers? Dimitri, what's one thing we did?
They poured tar on them and then put feathers on them.
So they tar and feathered some of the tax collectors. That was pretty bad. It could have killed them, and it might have, but I don't know details like that. So maybe Mr. Aiken will remember some, or not remember, but we'll know some of the details. What else did people do? They didn't just tar and feather. They also did two other words that I taught you yesterday. The colonists did these things. Do you remember what two other words I might have taught you yesterday? Hassanein? So strike wasn't the word I used, but you're in the exact ballpark. It wasn't strike, because strike means to stop working and do this word. But there's two words. So who remembers what one of the words was? Ryan? They protested. So protest means standing out there with signs or saying, no way, you shouldn't do this, rah, 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 but all peacefully, right? They didn't fight at that point. What else did they do? I taught you one other word. It wasn't protest and it wasn't strike. What was the third word that I taught you? I only have 3 people? Bless you. 4 people? Well, I won't call on anybody who makes those noises, so I won't ever call on anybody who makes those noises. It's just me. Charlie?
They rebelled.
Well, it is rebelling, but that wasn't the word that I used, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm looking for that one word that I actually taught you guys. Kendall?
They boycotted.
They boycotted things. Do you remember that boycotting means to not buy things because you're trying to protest against them? Like sugar, if they tax sugar crazily, then they won't buy sugar because they don't want you to get any tax money. If they tax the tea an awful lot, then they won't buy the tea because that's too expensive. You know, they're just saying we'll drink coffee instead or whatever. All right, so you remember those words I taught you, right? Awesome. All right, I'm very surprised that he's not calling us, so let me try one more time.
What if he doesn't call?
Well, I should check my email too in case he's emailed me.
There you are.
Hello.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well.
Can you see my kiddos?
Yeah, I can see most of them. I think I've got a little glare on my screen, but I can see most everybody, it looks like.
Oh, good.
You guys see me all right?
Yeah.
All right. So how's everybody this morning?
Good.
Good. What grade are we?
5th.
5th grade. All right. So, believe it or not, you're talking to me at Fort Loudon State Park in Von Orr, Tennessee. So I'm right now by the Great Smoky Mountains. We may or may not have some rain today, so if the picture suddenly cuts out, don't be alarmed. I'm moving to somewhere where there's some cover so I don't get drowned. But otherwise, here at Fort Loudon, let me see if I can give you a little brief view of the fort. If you look straight up there, you'll see a big lake and then all the buildings of the fort. The fort itself covers about 7 acres of ground, and it was built to house 100 soldiers, though at the high point there were 250 here right before the fort was surrendered.
That's something right.
So,
100 to 250
It
soldiers.
had a lot of folks packed
lived
in
that
there.
place. Cool.
The soldier I represent is a British soldier here in the Overhill Territory. The soldiers that were here came from South Carolina. They were the Independent Company of South Carolina. There was about 100 of them. And they were sent over here to strengthen relations with the Cherokees because you had this, where I'm at is the very end of the Cherokee Nation towards the west. So you're right in the middle of the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokees were helping the English fight against the French in the north. So the men would go off to fight, and they didn't have anybody left behind to help protect their women and children. So that's why the fort was put here. The Cherokee had been asking for years for the British to build a fort here to help protect their women and children while the men were away. So they came to this spot. Now, the fort was built in 1756. So you're looking at, excuse me, we're talking about before the American Revolution, obviously. Okay? And it would only be here till 1760, even though the commander of the fort and the engineer at the fort had really hoped this fort would last for years and years and years. But as we'll discuss here in a little bit, it wasn't to be. Now, the uniform I have on is obviously what color?
Red.
And then what did we call British soldiers?
Red coats.
Yeah, redcoats, because they wore red coats. It's not all that complicated. In this early period, the redcoats were not the bad guys yet. Because if you lived in North America, you were probably one of 3 or 4 different things. You were either British or a British subject, French or a French subject. If you lived in Florida, you might be Spanish, or you were a Native American. There were other people here, the Dutch were here, and other people were here, but those were the 3 primary forces here in North America. So you had the 13 colonies, right? And then you had the French up in the north, up in Canada. And then the French also controlled the entire Mississippi River all the way from the north to the south, and the French were down in Louisiana. So they controlled the whole west, and we controlled the whole east. So as we continue to expand, we kind of squeeze the Native Americans in between us, and we use them to fight. So the reason it's called the French and Indian War is here in America is because the French didn't have as many soldiers, but they had a whole lot of Indian allies. So they used their allies to help fight against the British. The British had far more soldiers than Indians. And everywhere else in the world, it's called the 7 Years' War. Most people, if you went to Europe and tried to talk to them about the French and Indian War, they might not know what you were talking about, because everywhere else considered the 7 Years' War. And this is truly the first world war. This was the first war fought on every continent where people lived at the time. So it was fought all over the world, even though we just think of it here in America as being right here in the colonies. All right? That pretty well takes care of the early history. Now, one of the direct results of this war, all right, we're fighting the French and Indian War. It's going to last until 1763, and the war will be over. Now, what happens in 1776?
You guys know? What happens in the year 1776? Hannah?
The Revolutionary War.
Absolutely.
part of it.
American Revolution.
That was
Now, getting into the Revolution, we all have heard the term, I'm sure you guys know the whole taxation without representation.
good. Give them a
But
thumbs
what
up.
we never talk about, yeah, very good. What we never talk about is why was there suddenly taxes they didn't used to have?